This video was sponsored by Card Kingdom. You can pre-order all the cards in this video by using the link in the description below. Hi everyone, I'm Nitsa Hone, and today I'm continuing with my Lord of the Rings Tales of Middle-earth limited set review. Yesterday, I looked at all the multicolored and colorless cards, and today we'll be looking at all the white cards. For each of these cards, I'll discuss how I think they'll play in Limited, and I'll sum up my thoughts by using a letter grade. If you're new to my set reviews, you can find out what my grades mean by looking in the description. A couple of things to keep in mind as we look at these cards. First, I'm only evaluating these for play in Limited and not in any other formats, and these are my evaluations of these cards before actually playing with them, so I of course won't be right about everything. I will be providing updates about the format here on the channel as I play it more and more. Lastly, only cards that appear in draft boosters will be reviewed in this series. I also want to let you know that I'm offering some set review related perks for both patrons and channel members. You get access to my ongoing notes during preview season, and by the end of the set review, you'll have a spreadsheet with all of my grades. If those perks sound interesting to you and you want to support the channel, you can find ways to become a channel member or a patron in the description. Alright, without further ado, let's look at the first white card in my Lord of the Rings Tales of Middle-earth set review, which is Banish from Edoras. For 4 generic into white, this is a common sorcery. It costs 2 less to cast if it targets a tapped creature. Exile target creature. This is passable removal, but certainly not premium. 5 mana is a lot to exile a creature at sorcery speed, and even though you get a discount on a tapped creature, cards that can only kill tapped creatures at sorcery speed are pretty rough, because it usually means your opponent got to hit you with the thing that you want to remove. It is still removal, and answers pretty much all creatures, but it's so clunky that it isn't the kind of removal you prioritize highly. I'm giving it a C. Next up, it's the Battle of Bywater, which for 1 generic and 2 white is a rare sorcery. It says destroy all creatures with power 3 or greater, then create a food token for each creature you control. It's a little weird that they just introduced the battle card type in the last set, and there's a card in this set with battle in its name that isn't a battle, but anyway, not killing everything is a little bit of a bummer, but this will usually be able to kill the best things on the battlefield. You can build around it to some extent too, by not having a bunch of creatures who get destroyed by it, and it isn't like that's super hard to do in white. Getting some food is nice upside to have as well. Overall, I think this does look pretty good. It's going to be awkward sometimes. Your opponent will have a bunch of small creatures this can't destroy. You'll have creatures that this destroys. But I think you'll be able to manufacture enough situations where it hurts your opponent more than it hurts you. And sometimes the impact it will have on the game will be absolutely massive. I'm giving it a B. Next up, it's Bill the Pony, which for 3 generic into white is a 1/4 legendary horse at uncommon. When it enters the battlefield, you create 2 food tokens, and you can sacrifice a food. Until end of turn, target creature you control assigns combat damage equal to its toughness rather than its power. 4 mana for a 1/4 is a horrible starting point, but 2 food tokens is some pretty real value, and that alone would probably make Bill playable. But it gets way better than that, because Bill can effectively be a 4/4 for a couple of turns if you use up the food, and of course if you have some other food around or more high toughness creatures around, this can be even more valuable. There's lots of stuff you can do with food in the format too. I'm giving this a B-. Next up, it's Boromir, Warden of the Tower. For 2 generic into white, this is a 3/3 legendary human soldier at rare. It's got vigilance. When an opponent casts a spell, if no mana was spent to cast it, counter that spell, and you can sacrifice Boromir, and creatures you control gain indestructible until end of turn. The ring tempts you. A 3 mana 3/3 with vigilance is already a playable card, and while his ability to counter free spells will almost never come up in Limited, his ability to give indestructibility to all of your creatures and have the ring tempt you is pretty good. I'm giving him a B. Next up, it's Dawn of a New Age, which for 1 generic into white is a mythic rare enchantment. It enters the battlefield with a hope counter on it for each creature you control. At the beginning of your end step, remove a hope counter from Dawn of New Age. If you do, draw a card. Then, if Dawn of a New Age has no hope counters on it, sacrifice it and you gain 4 life. This looks pretty good. You definitely need to have a board for this to do its thing. But even if you only have 2 or 3 creatures, you end up getting a 2 or 3 for 1 for only 2 mana, and you even gain some life when all is said and done. Because you do need to have some stuff going on, it can be pretty awkward in the early game, but by the middle of the game onward, it's hard to imagine situations where this doesn't deliver on the amount of mana you spend on it. It's going to grant you insurmountable card advantage in many games. I'm giving it a B+. Next up, it's Dunedain Blade, which for 1 generic into white is a common artifact equipment. Equipped creature gets +2/+1. It can equip to a human for only 1 generic mana, and it can equip to everything else for 3 mana. If you're paying 3 to equip this, it is really bad. If you're paying 1 to equip it enough of the time, it becomes pretty good. There are a lot of humans in white, as well as some equipment synergies in the set. I thought about giving this a build-around grade because it's so good when you're equipping it to humans, and so bad when you're equipping it to everything else. But I think it works well enough with what white is doing that the build-around grade isn't really necessary, and it's just a pretty good common. I'm giving it a C+. Next up, it's Eagles of the North, which for 5 generic and a white is a 3/3 bird soldier at common. It's got flying. When it enters the battlefield, creatures you control get +1/+0 and gain first strike until end of turn, and you can plane cycle it for 1, which means you pay 1 generic, discard it, and search your library for a planes and put it into your hand. This is not a good stat line, but the enter the battlefield ability will often be enough to drastically alter combat. +1/+0 and first strike together makes a whole lot of your board into effective attackers. Of course, you do need to have a significant board for this to really make a difference, but that's not a huge ask by the time you have 6 mana. The fact it has plane cycling is nice because in the early game, this is going to feel really bad in your opening hand, especially when you need to get your hands on some more land drops, but this can deliver there too. I'm giving this a C. Next up, it's East Farthing Farmer, which for 2 generic and a white is a 2/3 halfling peasant at common. When it enters the battlefield, you create a food token. When you do, target creature you control gets +1/+1 until end of turn for each food you control. A 3 mana 2/3 that makes a food is already probably playable, so giving +1/+1 to something when this enters is nice too, and sometimes it'll give more than that. I'm giving this a C. Next up, it's Eastmark Cavalier, which for 1 generic and a white is a 2/2 human knight at common. It's got vigilance, and when it deals damage to a goblin or orc, destroy that creature. This has passable stats as a 2 mana 2/2 with vigilance, but the other upside it has is really underwhelming. There will be some occasions where it lines up nicely, since it can trade with a larger goblin or orc, like with an amassed army, but a lot of the time this ability just doesn't matter, and even when your opponent does have a creature with one of those types, many of them are already just going to trade with the Cavalier. So most of the time this is just going to feel like a 2 mana 2/2 with vigilance, and these days that's a C-. Next up, it's Eowyn, Lady of Rohan, which for 2 generic and a white is a 2/4 legendary creature, human noble at uncommon. At the beginning of combat on your turn, target creature gains your choice of first strike or vigilance until end of turn. If that creature is equipped, it gains first strike and vigilance until end of turn instead. Equip abilities you activate cost 1 less to activate. Even with 0 equipment, Eowyn would be a nice card. First strike and vigilance are both very useful keywords to gain access to every combat, and she can even give them to herself. So her 3 mana 2/4 body combined with that, already a pretty good card. And on top of that, there's plenty of playable equipment in this format that will make her a lot better. This looks like a really good uncommon. I'm giving her a B+. Next up, it's Errand Rider of Gondor, which for 2 generic and a white is a 3/2 common human soldier. When it enters the battlefield, you draw a card. Then if you don't control a legendary creature, put a card from your hand on the bottom of your library. If you don't control a legendary creature, this gives you some decent card selection, and if you do control one, well, now we're talking about a 2-for-1. Generally, that seems like this means if you play this on turn 3 most of the time, it's just going to be card selection, but by the mid to late game, it will usually draw you a card straight up. There are just enough legendary creatures in the format that will usually be the case. The stats aren't great, of course, but this definitely does enough to make the cut most of the time. I'm giving this a C. Next, it's Escape from Orthanc, which for 1 white mana is a common instant. Target creature gets +1/+3 and gains flying until end of turn, untap it. 1 mana tricks are always worth a serious look in Limited. One of the best things about tricks is how much tempo you can get out of them. So when you're only paying 1 mana and this is helping you blank a removal spell because your creature's toughness is now high enough, or it helps your creature win combat because of the stats boost, you end up feeling really good about the outcome. It also means that if your opponent manages to respond to this, you do still get 2-for-1, of course, but you don't take as much of a tempo hit because you're only paying 1 mana. And overall, I think this trick has enough upside and it's cheap enough that this is the kind of trick that's going to make the cut in your aggressive white decks. In addition to the things I've already mentioned, it can also just be used before you attack to give your creature flying, which sometimes, depending on what you're giving flying to and what your opponent has in play, can just allow you to end the game with a big flyer in the air. So yeah, this does a lot of different things for 1 mana. It is still a trick. It has all the shortcomings tricks have, but this does sort of seem like the trick that most white decks are going to be happy with. I'm giving it a C. Next up, it's Esquire of the King, which for 1 white mana is a 1/1 human soldier at common. You can pay 4 generic and a white and tap it. Creatures you control get +1/+1 until end of turn. This ability costs 2 less to activate if you control a legendary creature. If you can make this cost 3, that is pretty good, especially if you've gone wide enough, and Red-white especially seems like it's interested in doing that. The bad news is, as a 1-mana 1/1, it is pretty irrelevant up until the point you can use its ability, and paying 5 for that ability isn't nearly as appealing. Enough stuff has to be going right for this card to actually do its thing that I think it's just a C-. Next up, it's Faramir, Field Commander, which for 3 generic and a white is a 3/3 legendary human soldier at uncommon. At the beginning of your instep, if a creature died under your control this turn, draw a card. Whenever the ring tempts you, if you choose a creature other than Faramir, Field Commander as your ring bearer, create a 1/1 white human soldier creature token. So I guess I should have mentioned this when I was talking about Boromir, but just a reminder, the ring tempts you, means that you get an emblem called the ring. It comes with a bonus for a creature that you choose as your ring bearer. Each time you get tempted by the ring, you get another ability from the ring emblem as you move down the card. So it's something that will augment one of your creatures. Faramir likes it when the ring tempts you and you choose something else because he gives you another body, which is really, really nice. On top of that, his other ability is pretty good too. If you play him in your second main phase after just attacking into a trade and you just get to play Faramir and draw a card, you're already going to feel like you're pretty far ahead of your opponent. And then if you start getting tempted by the ring and he starts cranking out 1/1s, he's going to feel pretty good too. His base stats aren't very good, but I think he does enough and it will be easy enough to draw a card with him and then get like 1/1/1 out of him that he looks pretty good. I'm giving him a B-. Next up, it's Flowering of the White Tree, which for 2 white mana is a rare legendary enchantment. Legendary creatures you control get +2/+1 and have ward 1, and non-legendary creatures you control get +1/+1. So this is Glorious Anthem for only 2 mana. It is legendary, so it's harder to have multiples in play, but that doesn't really matter in Limited. In Limited, this is just strictly better Glorious Anthem. Not only does it offer +1/+1 to your non-legendary creatures, it offers an even bigger boost, plus ward to all of your legendary ones, and there are a lot of legendaries at uncommon in this format, so that is going to matter. The one downside about a card like this, of course, is that you do have to have some board state going on for it to really be delivering, but that's not a huge ask. White decks in this format are largely going to be creature-heavy decks, and you're also going to have a bunch of legendary creatures in your deck. So this just looks like it's going to augment your board so much for so little that I think it sneaks into the lower bomb range. I'm giving it an A-. Next up, it's Fog on the Barrow Downs, which for 2 generic and a white is a common enchantment aura with enchant creature. Enchanted creature is a spirit and can't attack or block. This is solid removal. 3 mana pacifisms tend to be fine, though they aren't usually amazing because they don't entirely get rid of 100% of creatures, since they don't stop things like activated or triggered abilities. Enchantment-based removal also isn't great against things like bounce or flicker effects. Still, this shuts down most creatures for a fairly reasonable cost. I'm giving it a C+. Next up, it's Forge Anew, which for 2 generic and a white is a rare enchantment. When it enters the battlefield, return target equipment card from your graveyard to the battlefield. As long as it's your turn, you may activate equip abilities anytime you could cast an instant, and you can pay 0 rather than pay the equip cost of the first equip ability you activate during each of your turns. So as I've said, and we've already seen, there is equipment in this set, but this card is so all in on it that it just won't do enough in your typical white deck in the format. It isn't like equipment regularly ends up in your graveyard, especially in white, so mostly what you're going to get here is something that makes equipping things a lot more flexible and efficient, and that's just not going to be worth a card most of the time. I guess if you end up with a bunch of the rare and mythic equipment and a couple common ones and you have like 5 equipment in your deck that are actually worth playing, maybe you play this, but even then it seems like kind of a stretch because it won't really deliver a full card worth of value. I think it's just an F. Next up, it's Frodo, Sauron's Bane, which for 1 white mana is a 1/2 legendary halfling citizen at rare. You can pay 2 black-white hybrid mana, and if Frodo Sauron's Bane is a citizen, it becomes a halfling scout with base power and toughness 2/3 and lifelink, and you can pay 3 black mana, and if Frodo is a scout, it becomes a halfling rogue with, whenever this creature deals combat damage to a player, that player loses the game if the ring has tempted you 4 or more times this game, otherwise the ring tempts you. A 1 mana 1/2 that can fairly easily become a 2/3 with lifelink on the next turn is pretty decent. If you can make it a halfling rogue though, the upgrade isn't always going to be that impressive. Sure, being tempted by the ring gives you some good value, but Frodo actually getting in for damage on the opposing player is usually going to involve some extra work, as a 2/3 lifelink isn't exactly a world beater, and even if you make Frodo the ring bearer, he's going to have a hard time being able to get in for a hit at the right time. After all, if it has 2 power, there's still lots of things that can block him easily. That said, I do think this alternate win condition is attainable. The hardest part about it won't be getting tempted by the ring 4 times though, it'll be getting in for a hit on your opponent. I'm giving this a B-. Next up, it's Gandalf the White, which for 3 generic and 2 white is a 4/5 legendary avatar wizard at Mythic Rare. He's got Flash. You can cast legendary spells and artifact spells as though they had Flash. If a legendary permanent or an artifact entering or leaving the battlefield causes a triggered ability of a permanent you control to trigger, that ability triggers an additional time. A 5-mana 4/5 with Flash is already fairly playable, and Gandalf does a lot more than that. There are enough legendaries and artifacts in this set that giving those Flash definitely matters, and doubling the triggered abilities of those types of permanents is great too, though not all of them have them. He's not going to be able to take over games all the time, as he needs a little bit of help from your deck's composition, but making your deck work well with Gandalf doesn't seem like a huge challenge, especially when the baseline is still a 5-mana 4/5 with Flash. I do think he falls a little bit short of being a bomb. His ability to double triggers just isn't going to matter often enough for him to be more than a B+. Next up, it's Hobbit Sting, which for 1 generic and a white is a common instant. It deals X damage to target creature, where X is the number of creatures you control plus the number of foods you control. This looks like nice removal. White has a decent amount of food and lots of cards that help you go wide, so this will often have no problem doing about 3 damage, and that's an okay place. Sometimes it'll do even more. There are, of course, the awkward times when your board isn't where it needs to be to take full advantage. Sometimes you're like 1 creature short of being able to kill your opponent's thing, and that's pretty annoying. So it's not a perfect removal spell, and certainly not premium, but it's pretty nice. I'm giving it a C+. Next up, it's Landreval Horizon Witness, which for 4 generic and a white is a 3/4 legendary bird noble at uncommon. It's got flying, and whenever 2 or more creatures you control attack a player, target attacking creature without flying gains flying until end of turn. A 5-mana 3/4 with flying these days is a C- at the very best, but if you're attacking with one other creature along with Landreval, who's likely to be able to attack reasonably well because of flying, you can then also just give another creature flying when you attack, and that kind of effect, we've seen it so many times in Limited, that kind of effect ends up being really powerful. Flying's just such a great keyword. Giving your best creature flying while cracking in with Landreval is going to be a really powerful thing to do on the turn after you play it. So the stats aren't great, but the ability is good enough that I think this is a B-. Next up, it's Lost to Legend, which for 2 white mana is an uncommon instant. It says put target non-land historic permanent into its owner's library 4th from the top. Artifacts, legendaries, and sagas are historic. There are enough historic permanents in this format for Lost to Legends to be worth playing. I think most decks are going to have like 7 things this can target, and while it may not permanently get rid of a card, it's still a 1-for-1 trade, and 4 cards deep means you don't need to worry about it for a while. It can't target everything, but it is incredibly efficient, and I think that's enough for me to consider it premium removal. I'm giving it a B-. Next up, it's Nimble Hobbit, which for 1 generic and a white is a 1/3 halfling peasant at common. When it attacks, you can sacrifice a food or pay 2 generic and a white, and when you do, tap target creature an opponent controls. Tapping opposing creatures tends to be a good effect in Limited when you're playing an aggro deck, but paying 3 for the effect is really rough. Giving up a food is a lot more appealing, but you're still attacking with a 1/3, and there's a pretty good chance that even when you tap down an opposing creature with this, your opponent can easily take this down in combat, and only having 1 turn of this effect on a 1/3 doesn't seem that good to me, especially after the early stages of the game. I'm giving this a C-. Next up, it's Now for Wrath, Now for Ruin, which for 3 generic and a white is a common sorcery. Put a +1/+1 counter on each creature you control. They gain vigilance until end of turn. The ring tempts you. This is not a bad payoff for going wide. Vigilance is a great addition to the counters because it makes it a lot easier for you to play offense and defense with your newly buffed board. This can often really win you a race. The ring tempting you will usually mean you get to upgrade one of your creatures additionally, too. This probably needs a build-around grade because if you aren't a deck playing a ton of creatures and cards that can make multiple bodies, you probably don't play this most of the time. Even with 3 things in play, this probably isn't good enough. But if you are a deck that's good at getting 5+ creatures in play, this starts to be a pretty appealing card. So I think it's probably a D in your typical deck in the format and a C+ in the right deck. Next up, it's Protector of Gondor, which for 3 generic and a white is a 3/3 human soldier at common. When it enters the battlefield, you make a 1/1 white human soldier creature token. We see versions of this card all the time, and it's always fine. It's pretty much exactly what you should expect to get from a 4-mana common. 4/4 of stats spread across 2 bodies. There are a few cards in this set that trigger when humans enter the battlefield, and this will trigger those twice. It's also good at helping you go wide, which white is certainly interested in. So it's certainly going to have a home in the format, but it's also not a card that you really prioritize that highly, giving it a C. Next up, it's Reprieve, which for 1 generic into white is an uncommon instant. It says return target spell to its owner's hand, draw a card. So this is basically a white remand, and that's pretty nice. Sure, your opponent gets the card back and can cast it in the future, but Reprieve also replaces itself, so getting tempo is actually a reasonable deal. There will be times in the late game where your opponent can just cast the thing, you bounce without a whole lot of extra effort, but the fail case is still that you get to draw a card, giving this a C+. Next up, it's Rosy Cotton of South Lane, which for 2 generic into white is a 1/1 legendary halfling peasant at uncommon. When she enters the battlefield, you create a food token, and whenever you create a token, put a +1/+1 counter on target creature you control other than Rosy. So, provided you have at least one other creature in play, she's a 3-mana 1/1 that gives you a food token and puts a +1/+1 counter somewhere. That's probably a card I would already play, but creating more tokens means you can really go crazy with +1/+1 counters. Keep in mind it doesn't just mean food, so making 1/1 human tokens will also trigger this ability. So this has a good baseline and absolutely massive upside. I'm giving her a B. Next up, it's Samwise the Stout-Hearted, which for 1 generic into white is an uncommon legendary halfling peasant. He's got flash, and when he enters the battlefield, choose up to 1 target permanent card in your graveyard that was put there from the battlefield this turn, return it to your hand, then the ring tempts you. This card looks completely insane at first, but we've seen a lot of these effects that return things from your graveyard to your hand before that have a strict timing restriction, and they basically always underperform. Obviously, if he always got you back a permanent from your graveyard, as a 2-mana 2/1 with flash, that would almost be in the lower bomb range, I think, because that's such an easy 2-for-1. It would be a B+ at the very worst, but this restriction is a big deal. It's just not always going to line up that you can just hold on to Samwise until some permanent has died at the right time, and then you can flash him in and get the card back and get that awesome, cheap, efficient 2-for-1. That said, you will be able to do it often enough that he's still pretty good. I'm giving him a B-. Next, it's Second Breakfast, which for 2 generic into white is a common instant. Up to 2 target creatures each get +2/+1 until end of turn, create a food token. Sometimes this kind of trick that buffs 2 separate things can generate a 2-for-1, and when that happens it feels amazing. But with a toughness boost of only 1, more often than not at least one of your creatures is still going to go down. 3 mana is a lot to spend on a trick too. I'd much rather have the 1 mana trick in this format than this one, and that kind of efficiency is really important because tricks are already so narrow and have such specific use cases. I'm giving this a C-. Next up, it's Shire Sheriff, which for 1 generic into white is a 2/2 halfling soldier at uncommon. It's got vigilance. When it enters the battlefield, you may sacrifice a token. When you do, exile target creature an opponent controls until Shire Sheriff leaves the battlefield. So you won't always be able to exile something with this, but there are enough tokens in this set, food and otherwise, that this will function as removal often enough, and the baseline is a sort of passable card anyway. Obviously, giving up food or a random 1/1 token is the ideal thing, but you can also give up something like an army, and sometimes that will be worth it too. I'm giving this a B. Next up, it's Slip on the Ring, which for 1 generic into white is a common instant. Exile target creature you own, then return it to the battlefield under your control. The ring tempts you. This is cheaper than most versions of this effect we've seen lately, but most versions of this effect will also draw you a card, and the ring tempts you isn't quite as good as drawing a card. Still, this will be effective in decks that end up with enough cards with Enter the Battlefield abilities. It's a bit of a bummer it can only hit creatures, as Blinking Sagas could be particularly valuable. You can, of course, use it to help a creature dodge removal and stuff like that too, but still, it seems like this type of card basically never makes the cut in limited formats these days. It isn't a disaster in the right deck, but actually generating a card of value with it is harder than you think. We've seen this be the case with basically every version of this effect in countless limited formats at this point. While the list of situations where this is good seems sort of long, the percentage of the time that long list of situations come up is relatively small. I'm giving this a D+. Next up, it's Soldier of the Grey Host, which for 3 generic into white is a 2/2 spirit soldier at common. It's got flash and flying, and when it enters the battlefield, target creature gets +2/+0 until end of turn. This has what are well below rate stats these days, and while the Enter the Battlefield ability can be useful, it also isn't great. This does have flash, so sometimes it can work like a combat trick, but a +2/+0 boost isn't exactly the sort of thing that helps your creature survive combat a large percentage of the time. I'm giving this a C-. Next up, it's Stalwarts of Osgiliath, which for 4 generic and a white is a 4/3 human soldier at common. When it enters the battlefield, the ring tempts you. Whenever you draw your second card each turn, put a +1/+1 counter on Stalwarts of Osgiliath. This starts out with some pretty bad stats, but it does have the ability to grow reasonably well. The fact the ring tempts you could actually help you get the Stalwarts going too, since one of the ring's bonuses is that your creature loots when it attacks, which will mean the Stalwarts get a counter sometimes the turn you play them. Still, a 5 mana card that starts with 3 toughness can be a huge liability. Lots of 2 mana removal, and cheap creatures can deal with it or trade with it, and that's a pretty big blow to your tempo. I'm giving this a C. Next up, it's Tale of Tenuviel, which for 3 generic and 2 white is an uncommon enchantment saga. Chapter 1 says target creature you control gains indestructible for as long as you control Tale of Tenuviel. Chapter 2 says return target creature card from your graveyard to the battlefield. And Chapter 3 says up to 2 target creatures you control each gain lifelink until end of turn. The ceiling here is incredibly high, mostly as a result of Chapter 2. If you can set this up to reanimate something reasonable, that's going to be great. Doing it with the land cyclers seems particularly interesting. Chapter 1 and 3 deliver some value too, and it is value that's more easily accessible, but it's also value with a much lower ceiling. Making something indestructible for a couple of turns is usually going to have at least some impact on the game. It won't always be a huge impact, but I mean, it will allow you to attack or block more effectively, almost assuredly, and lifelink can help alter a race. But if you aren't able to reanimate something reasonable with Chapter 2, this is going to feel pretty bad overall. I think that limits just how good it can be. Sometimes it will feel amazing. Other times, you'll get like 3 medium effects that don't really feel like they were worth the mana or the card. I'm giving it a C. Next up, it's Took Reaper, which for 1 generic and a white is a 2/1 halfling peasant at common. When it dies, the ring tempts you. This has mediocre stats that are like a D these days. Getting tempted by the ring is nice upside, and does mean you'll come out ahead in trades, but it also isn't the kind of upside to get that excited for, and it's not like this is that good at trading. I'm giving it a C-. Next up, it's War of the Last Alliance, which for 3 generic and a white is a rare enchantment saga. Chapter 1 and 2 both search your library for a legendary creature card, you reveal it and put it into your hand and then shuffle. And Chapter 3 says creatures you control gain double strike until end of turn, the ring tempts you. I don't think this looks like anything special. The first 2 chapters don't add to the board in any meaningful way, and paying 4 mana to tutor something up isn't a good rate. You do get 2 cards out of it eventually, and at that point, I'm reasonably happy, but it still seems pretty slow, and there are certainly enough legendaries in the format that you'll usually have 2 that you can still search up when you play this. I guess there will be some times where you had like 4 legendaries and you already got 3 of them, and that will be really frustrating and make this card even worse. But, in the end, you get 2 cards out of this, and then it gives double strike to your whole board, and the ring tempting you can end up upgrading one of your creatures at the same time. So the end result here, I do think, is fairly powerful. I'm just concerned about how slow this is at doing something that actually impacts the board. Because it does give you back 2 cards of value, and then the double strike effect can be really powerful in the right board state, I could see this being better than I expect, but right now I'm just skeptical about how slow and clunky it feels, and I think I'm going to start it at a C. Next up, it's Westfold Rider, which for 1 generic and a white is a 3/1 human knight at common. You can sacrifice it to destroy an artifact or enchantment, activate only as a sorcery. These are passable-based stats, and there's lots of artifacts and enchantments in this set. It's a bit of a bummer, it can only destroy them at sorcery speed, unlike most versions of this we've seen before, but the fact that this is a very main deckable card with a useful creature type that can also function as a disenchant makes it pretty appealing. I'm giving it a C. And our last card is You Cannot Pass, which for 1 white mana is an uncommon instant. It says destroy target creature that blocked or was blocked by a legendary creature this turn. It's a little sad that they chose this card to represent such an epic moment because it is mediocre at best. Even in a set with lots of legendaries, this sort of removal spell tends to just be too narrow, even at 1 mana. Keep in mind, making your creature into a ring bearer can also make anything legendary, so it's going to be easier to set this up if you have everything that says the ring tempts you on it can help set a card like this up. But I'm still incredibly skeptical about how narrow this is. The thing has to block or be blocked by a legendary creature. That's not always going to happen, and you're not always going to have a legendary creature. So there's 2 conditions you have to fulfill for this to feel worthwhile, and I think that's just too much. I think it's probably just a D+. So, those are all the white cards in Lord of the Rings Tales of Middle-earth. Tomorrow I'll be back with a look at all the blue cards. If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to like it and share it. If you want to make sure you catch the rest of this set review, don't forget to subscribe. And if you want to catch up on the other parts of the review, you should see a playlist on your screen shortly. Thanks for watching.